Today we have another inspiring day planned for you, starting with two excellent speakers during this hour. In between the two speaker presentations, our Sunbelt co-chairs, or actually just Aaron Wright today, one of our Sunbelt co-chairs, are going to come up on stage and announce the Sunbelt's first ever Best of Show exhibit booth and award winners. First, we will begin with Larry Haines, the founder of Sunconomy, a company that produces 3D printed concrete homes. Larry will update us on what 3D printed home construction is and its future as an alternative to traditional sticks and bricks built homes. Sunconomy is designing and building 3D printed homes, teaching other contractors and real estate developers how to build affordable homes that will last centuries. Larry's website, just before we start, is weprinthouses.com. Please help me welcome Mr. Larry Haines.
Well, good morning, everybody. I appreciate you getting up after last night's festivities to come, and it's always tough to be the first speaker, but here we go. I've got 30 minutes to go through about an hour's worth of slides. So Sunconomy is the company, weprinthouses.com is the website. I wanted to go over with you real quickly what kind of why we started to do this. One is that affordable housing is becoming more and more difficult for more and more people to own. You got 42.4% of the U.S. workers don't make enough money to basically buy or rent a one-bedroom house. If you look at the statistics here, like in California, it'll take you over 90 hours a week just to be able to afford a one-bedroom home on average. It's a major problem. It's a $10 trillion problem around the world, affordable housing. Basically, the demand, I like statistics and data. Basically, back in 2006, when the whole meltdown started, you're looking at undersupply of about 330,000 units a year. You add on to that the 400,000 or so houses that were damaged or destroyed in the 3 hurricanes a couple of years ago, all the forest fires and stuff out in California. You're looking at another 400,000 plus houses that need to be replaced. So why did I choose Texas? Number one, I live here, but number two, it's got 8 of the top 15 fastest growing counties in the country. And so that means about 630 people a day are coming to Texas. And it's typically, Dallas, Fort Worth area, Dayton, down to Houston, San Antonio, and Austin. So what is 3D printing? So ASTM defines, 3D printing is the, quote, fabrication of objects through the deposition of material using a printhead, nozzle, or other printing technology. So all that really means in a nutshell is, like if you think of your desktop printer, you've got the mechanism, the plastic housing, and so forth. You've got essentially the ink, which is our geopolymer concrete, and then you've got the software and the substrate, which is the paper. Well, we're printing on insulation, and we're using it as a kind of an inkjet as opposed to additive layer. And I'll show you some of the different systems in just a minute. So here's some of the different companies that are out there doing it. I'm basically one of the first ones to get I am the first one to actually get a full-blown permit all the way through to get a certificate of occupancy in building a first house. There was another company called Icon at South by Southwest. They built a model home, but it was a provisional permit, and they'll never get a certificate of occupancy for it because it just didn't meet building standards. The two biggest questions I get are from folks like you is, have you built one yet? And can I get permits? And the answer is, yes, we did get permits to build one. We're in that process now. We're building on a very difficult lot up outside of Austin, Texas, and be happy to talk to you about it later, but I just don't have time to do that right this second. So Sunconomy is number one. Apis Core is a Russian company. They build an additive where it's like a tube of toothpaste where you just put layer upon layer. The Amatron Systems out of the Arizona area, they're building blocks, where they put the blocks then in place. Branch Technology is another company. I'll show you in a minute what they look like. That's actually using a 40-foot long, if you can imagine this stage and having a 6-arm axis robot printing a wall section. They print wall sections out of plastic, basically. Contour Crafting is another. I won't go into all this, but there's a bunch of different companies out there doing a bunch of different things, and the biggest issue everybody is having in the industry is getting permits. This is me 2 years ago. I went to buy the Russians' 3D printing system that prints the walls in an additive layer. That wall system you see up in the upper right-hand corner is about 16 inches thick. It's 2 of my hands wide. It's concrete. They took about 3 weeks, 4 weeks to build this house. They said they did it in 24 hours, but it wasn't really true. And then they basically just build the walls. And that's part of the problem in the industry is people want to build wall systems. CyBe is out of Northern Europe. They have a little tractor unit that basically goes up and they'll print the wall section and then move the tractor and build another wall section and move a tractor and build another wall section. Contour crafting back in 2005, 2006 got patents for the process, and that's kind of where everyone started looking at building concrete because of the professor out at USC that got the patents to do this. They still have not built a house in the US. I was at the BOMA show over in Munich 3 months ago, and they're hoping to get their first house built sometime in late this year, as he said, out in Las Vegas. This is the branch technology system I was talking about. It's on a long track. If you look at the system, they can build, you know, kind of the structure or the bones, but they still have to come in and put insulation. You still have to put siding. You still have to put sheetrock, whatever it is that you're going to do in terms of the wall system. So they're just really building the bones of it. I'm a contractor, have been almost all my life in the construction industry for over 40 years. Contractors want to build houses, not walls. They want to go through the design, the engineering, the permitting, the building, the appraisal, the bank loan, and sell the house and get out of it and go on and do the next one. That's me. That's that famous guy, Larry Haines, down there on the bottom. Okay, come on, laugh a little. So this next little thing, I'm just going to take a quick 2 minutes and show you a video. Hopefully it'll answer some of your questions.
Larry, let's start. Tell us your name and what your background is before you got involved with 3D printing.
A varied background, but mostly in construction. My name's Larry Haines. I live in Houston, just outside of Houston in the Woodlands. And I've done everything from mechanical contracting, sales from mechanical contractor to home building to commercial work for about the past 38 years.
What do you see as the benefits and what are the benefits to people as well as to builders for using this technology?
Well, I think for the people, they're going to be living in a house that lasts for centuries, not decades, that can withstand an EF5 tornado, for instance. Mm-hmm. We can build into homes the renewable energy, rainwater catchment system. You know, those are the kinds of things that people will be looking for in the future, is to integrate lifestyle, to integrate entertainment, to integrate the healthcare ability to take either care of people or to live a better lifestyle. And on the builder side, I've already got a lot of builders based on the videos that we saw that have contacted me and want to buy the equipment and build in Florida and Carolinas and just about every state in the union. So we're not going to have an issue trying to get the builders to jump on the bandwagon because they already want to do that. It's just a question of having the equipment and having the ability from a procurement standpoint to put all the parts and pieces together along with the design, the engineering, and getting the permits. And that's the biggest question they have. Can you build these in this area? And we can show them how to do that.
So this is the 3D print system that I have. It's basically mounted on a trailer. But if you think of what we're doing is we're building a skip panel, which is a structural concrete insulated panel. We're building it with geopolymer concrete, which is much stronger, has much better attributes than Portland cement, about 90% less CO2, so the environmental people like it. And it's basically just taking the cement and spraying it on, getting it past that wire coating, and then putting a finish coating on it. And you're doing it all with robotic systems. We do that inside and out. So I just wanted to give you a real quick idea of kind of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And that's the system. Basically, as a contractor, I want to be able to get on the job site and I want to be able to start work right away, and I've got all the components there with the exception of the concrete, the rebar, that needs to be brought onto the job site. This is the system. As you see, the first two on the left, that's the robotic platform that can actually go through a 36-inch door, so we can do the inside of the house and the outside of the house. We can do the roof. We can do the floor if you're up, like on the lot we're building now. I've got 7-foot columns all the way to 18.5-foot columns because we're going down a slope. and then we're building the house on top of that so I could actually spray under the house, the sides of the house, over the house, and on the inside as well. We're using geopolymer concrete. That concrete is basically used by the Romans 2,000 years ago for many of the things that are still standing, the aqueducts, the port cities that go down steps into the water, been hit with saltwater waves for 2,000 years and they're still standing. So we want to use concrete that lasts for centuries. So we build faster, typically on a house that's 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 square feet, depending on the lot you choose. It's going to take somewhere between 10 and 14 days to build the structure. To what we call dry it in. And if you compare it to stick-built houses, you'll see why in a minute that it's going to be faster. It's also much stronger. We're building it to 220-mile-an-hour wind loads, 8+ earthquakes, storm surge, those kinds of things with our geopolymer concrete can actually repel water because it's hydrophobic. And it saves on material and time especially. So I wanted to talk to you about this because wherever you are, you have something that looks like this bell curve, if you will, of like in Houston, our bell curve looks very similar to what you see here. It's 100,000 to 250,000 is our sweet spot in terms of sale price. So that's what the most houses that are being built in the Houston area, and it's been over $3,000, 3,000 units for the past 3-4 years. So basically we look at the digital construction process and everybody's looking at the piece of equipment. Oh, you have a 3D printer. Well, it's not the 3D printer, it's the process that we use for our business model that's really important. So when you look at the architectural and engineering design, you get into the permitting, the procurement, the construction, these are the kind of cost savings I think we can do as you're building multiple houses, as you can save somewhere between 17 and 28% on the cost of the house, you know, as you get up to speed and learn how to use it and integrate your supply chain. Everything is going digital, as we all know, so we want to integrate from the BIM model and use that to integrate our suppliers, our customers using AR and VR. We want to integrate that whole process to squeeze the wasted time out of it and also to improve the supply chain and get the parts and pieces that you need to build houses. We're essentially eliminating carpenters, sheetrockers, roofings, and if you want to change the color, you can add coatings, but you don't have to because it's hydrophobic. I hope there's no subcontractors in here. National Association of Home Builders put out this a couple years ago, and I just wanted to use it to kind of give an idea because I thought it was the best chart to kind of showcase where we touch. So everything in a circle of red is where we touch based on the NAHB's cost of the building a house on average. So we look at framing, exterior wall finishes, roofing, insulation, painting, flooring, and drywall. All of those things are what we either eliminate or we improve. And essentially we're looking at those being about $93,000. We think we can build that system, those things we touch for about 70 grand, saving about 10% of the cost of the actual construction. If you also increase, like I was talking about before, your digital integration along your supply chain and stuff, you'll be saving overhead and time there as well. And I look at it like from a project plan. I love using these kinds of charts instead of the Microsoft Gantt. And basically, that's the area where we're touching. We're operating to build the structure on the front end to really increase the time, or excuse me, decrease the time it takes to build. Out in California and some other places where labor shortages are really high, you're gonna look at eliminating the need for them and also the conflict between them. You know, like somebody screws up somebody else's work and they go back and forth and you get change orders and all kinds of things that you just, you know, you have to deal with. I want to eliminate that as much as possible and basically get the building process down as good as you can. When you look at the labor shortages in different areas, I think that's probably the number one or at least the number two issue around our problems in the industry of trying to build houses economically. It's going to be labor shortages. I won't go into depth, but I'm trying to build a social impact company that kind of brings back that workforce training and apprenticeship, if you will, with veterans organizations. My brother happens to be the chairman of the Non-Commissioned Officers Association, so I have a little bit of an in there. We're going to be doing grants for workforce development programs to teach veterans on how to build these houses. So this kind of gets into the business model, and these are probably this slide and the next one are probably the two most important ones to me. Is you basically take that building information model, that software, that digital platform, and then you integrate it with all these other aspects of how to build houses, how to build the real estate developments, with the teleconstruction, being able to basically everybody look at the same page at any time and keep the revisions and stuff. We all know about those things. The geo information, when you're using, like it shows down on the bottom, the UAVs or the drones, you're able to integrate the actual terrain information with your models, so it speeds up your estimating. You're able to build the models and digitally show people what it would look like on their lot. The supply chain is probably the #1 issue of integrating a supply chain with all the different parts and pieces from suppliers around the world. That's why we're trying to deal with international suppliers as well as national suppliers. The numerical simulation, that's very important. In the patent that I filed, we're actually looking at using sensor technology within the wall systems, the roofs, the floors, to gather information over time, not only on how the concrete cured, but also to be able to provide us a database of how it performs against certain weather patterns. Like if you live along the coast and you get hurricanes come in, you can actually correlate the flex of the wall or the roof or the way the building functions within that storm, collect that data over multiple ones, and in talking to the insurance companies, that's the things they need to drive the costs down. If they can ensure themselves that this technology and these building systems can make a house that's disaster resistant, then they'll be able to give your customers a lower cost of operations over the hazard insurance over the lifetime of the project. In addition to the materials, the building performance, when you look at not having to redo a roof or redo siding, let's say over a 20 or 30 year period, you're looking at about, I don't know, at $20,000 to $40,000 of the operations or the owner's costs that they will avoid by not having to replace those things or repair those items on their house over the long term. So you really have a sales point to the person that's buying it. It's really low maintenance homes that keep your costs down. And then if you add things like solar and that sort of thing, you can actually get the utility bills down as well. I won't go into all these, but essentially it's really important to look at your business model and how all these things integrate into it. And then the reason I like it is because it's a single source of not only all of your models within the BIM system that people can pull up, your contractors can pull up, subs can pull up, homeowners can pull up if they're going to be buying your stuff, and you can integrate it into the virtual reality and AR systems that are out there to integrate all the choices that they have and literally have them select their home via not having a model that they have to walk through. They're walking through it virtually. It's a single source of all your documents, a single source of all your tasks, which makes the job training and all that, the ability to kind of keep everybody on the same page, whether they're in the field or in the office. And then it's highly accessible. It's open to all people. When you include blockchain, you're basically tracking everything through, the entire life cycle of that house. So basically it makes it easier for everybody across the top here to integrate into your systems, which is really cool. This is a house, this is actually a 1,558 square foot house. When we bought the lot, we just basically took this house and made it a little bit longer and a little bit less deep so it would fit. But this is the house that we're building up in the Austin area. By doing the flat roof like this, we increased the actual size of the house from 18, or in our case, we're building an 1,810 square foot house, but we're also having an 1,800 plus square foot roof deck that can be used. And where it's situated, it overlooks Lake Travis and just have this massive panorama views, which increases the value to your buyer. This is the type of system you're looking at. As you kind of saw this printing, this is what it's going to look like. You can either use an EPS foam panel or a polyurethane panel, and that's the floor plan of the house we're actually building. And then what's really important from your perspective is, can people get loans on this? And the answer is yes. We're working with a company called Thrive Mortgage, I think they're, except for 11 states, and they can get licensed in those. They just don't have business now to justify it. We can do VA loans, FHA loans, conventional, two-time close through this mortgage company. We also have financing for the equipment. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay. I kind of wanted to basically save a minute or two in case anybody had any questions. Can't really see. Anybody have a question? Yes, sir. What's the minimum investment to get into the business? Well, number one, you should be in the business as a contractor already because it's really hard to teach people from the ground up. So have a construction business. The cost of the equipment, the training, and the license for our system is $450,000, and you can finance that. And if anybody's interested, I tell people you probably in Texas, you probably need to be building 3 or 4 houses a month in order to justify that in the 1,000 to 1,200 square foot range. If you're building bigger, it'll be less. If you're building in San Francisco, you need to build a garage every now and then. Yes, sir.
Building code challenge.
Okay, so the reason I chose this system was the panels in 2009 were the SIP panels and SCIP panels are a method that was already adopted. We have NFPA fire ratings, we have Dade County wind testing. Basically, if the panels themselves have ICC reports on them, and that's one of the reasons I want to do this, because as a contractor, I want to build houses, not walls, and I don't want to have to fight the permitting office everywhere we go. And so we use that. All we did is really automate. If you stop and think about it, we automated, instead of somebody, if you've seen people like build a swimming pool, there's a guy typically with a hose doing this, and there's another guy holding the hose behind him, and there's another couple of guys kind of moving it around the pool. We do it all with robotics. It's that system that moves it around for you. And I have a guy standing there doing this. Anybody know any millennials that do this? So you've opened up the labor shortage right there. Any other questions? Maybe one more. Yes, sir, in the back. Where are we putting the electrical? If you go back to this, maybe we'll go back. Can you push this back one to the floor plan? My thing isn't working. Up to one more. One more. Uno more. Okay, there you go. So you see the polyurethane insulation on the interior. You've got about 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch of space. You're putting the electrical in there. If you're doing plumbing, we try to keep most of the plumbing on the inside walls. But all you would do before you put the concrete on is you'd cut that wire, take a hot knife, put enough space in there for your vent line or whatever it is you're going to do, or your box if you want it to, it's got to stick out a certain distance. So you really don't run into the problem electrically, but on plumbing, then you'd come back and after you cut that wire, you'd put a larger piece of wire back on it and use wire ties. Yes, sir?
So do you conventionally frame the interior walls?
You can use metal studs, or we've got the panels that are 2-inch instead of the 4-inch, and you can basically just spray those as well. I think my time is up. Oh, a few more? Okay, I don't want to take his time because, anyone else? Yes. Over here, I think I saw a hand. Anybody? Be quick.
I'm loud. What type of, it looks like you just have one style, contemporary. What about all the other exterior finishes?
You can do anything. We can span with the panels themselves. We can span about a little over 13 feet. Just using the panel and rebar. So you'd basically have to put in a rim joist system, like a beam, and then just run your panels off of that if you wanted a 512 pitch or whatever. So you can build conventionally. I just like this because actually I went to high school in Europe and a lot of their homes were built like this, so I got to spend a lot of time on the Greek islands and I really like the look of it. Yes, sir. One more. Go ahead, just real loud. Preliminary HERS rating on the one in Austin. With the urethane, we have about 7.1 on just the per inch on the insulation. And I don't have the HERS rating on it yet because we're not done. Anyone else? That's it. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I will be around. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, for the Introducing us to that fascinating concept. At this time, I would like to invite Scott Norman to come up and introduce our next speaker to continue the discussion on future of housing.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate that. Well, what an excellent start to the morning. That was very, very interesting, Mr. Haines, and I know look forward to visiting with you more about that. To continue our discussion on the future of housing and going even a little more bigger picture, we're very honored to have Dr. Dietz with us today, who's going to provide the latest in economic trends and updates affecting our industry. Dr. Robert Dietz is Chief Economist for the National Association of Home Builders, as all of y'all know, in Washington, D.C., where his responsibilities include housing market analysis, forecasting and industry surveys, and housing policy research. Prior to joining NAHB in 2005, Dr. Dietz worked as an economist for the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. He has testified before Congress on housing, economic, and tax issues, and he's a leading expert on home construction analysis and trends. His team does a wonderful job serving our industry, and their economic research is published daily on NAHB's Eye on Housing blog. If you're not a subscriber to it, I recommend you do so. Please help me welcome, and we're so glad he's here, Dr. Robert Dietz.
Scott, yeah, thanks. It's good to join you this morning. He said team. I often don't get the chance to say this. It really is a team. We've got 12 economists back in D.C. doing the hard work to kind of make these slides, but it's good to join you here in Texas. I was here last year talking about the benefits of tax reform that we achieved under the leadership of your own Granger McDonald at the helm of NAHB. Today I'm talking about housing affordability concerns. This is going to blend nicely with the material that Larry walked you through. We're currently looking at a housing affordability crisis in the country, and we certainly saw the impacts of that last year when mortgage interest rates reached a 5% rate. And it really took the wind out of the sails of the market. So I'm going to walk you through where we are right now and some of the trends that we think are in play. Keep an eye on the idea of we have to surmount this housing affordability crisis. All right, so the first slide. Where are we in terms of overall housing affordability? This is the NAHB Wells Fargo Housing Opportunity Index. And the numbers here basically represent the percent of new and existing home sales that are affordable for a family right in the middle of the income distribution, a typical household. So affordability peaked here in 2012 when about 8 out of 10 new and existing home sales were affordable. And you can see the trend over the post-Great Recession period, a period of time where we've had the housing deficit that Larry put up in one of his slides. And the result of that, during that time period, home prices have grown faster than incomes. And so today only 6 out of 10 new and existing home sales are affordable for a typical family. And what we think is interesting is the geography of this really varies quite a lot. Now, I think we all kind of instinctively know that it's the coastal markets that are the least affordable. I feel like I'm picking on California all the time on this, but if you look at kind of the state of California, San Francisco and Los Angeles, housing affordability measure said 61 for the country. In Los Angeles and San Francisco, it's 6% of new and existing home sales are affordable for a typical household in those markets. And you see the same kind of issues here, Portland, Seattle, all these markets in deep red are kind of the bottom quartile in terms of affordability. But there's some interesting other markets that are in that kind of bottom quartile. I'll just kind of point out Boise. Boise is an example of what happens with those declines in housing affordability. Individuals have moved from California markets, Seattle and Portland markets to Boise, and there has not been sufficient housing production to keep up with that growth in population. That's pushed up home prices, and it's reduced housing affordability in these markets. So it's not just a coastal issue. It's spreading in the rest of the country as we continue to underbuild, and of course it was made worse last year when we got the spike in interest rates. I put up the scores for all the major Texas markets. Dallas is not on there. I had a separate slide that I took out. Dallas currently has a score of 52. So that's a good example there of a market where about half of the home sales are affordable. The trend over most of the Texas markets is the same that we see nationwide. declining housing affordability, and that therefore is a reason we need to continue to renew our focus on trying to find ways to bend the cost curve to provide additional housing supply at affordable levels. All right, so we'll take a step back. What are the drivers of housing demand, particularly locally? Well, you can see here the data. Texas has been growing more than twice as fast in terms of overall population than the country as a whole. Take a look at the 2015 data. There are the numbers at the top of the chart. 1.9% growth rate for the state of Texas compared to 0.7 for the country as a whole. So more than twice as fast. The downside, yes, the growth rates have been slowing. So Texas is still growing twice as fast as the country as a whole, but there is kind of this slowing trend. So you're in a good position. Housing affordability conditions in local markets are relatively competitive for much of the country. Population gains are continuing, but I think we have to keep an eye on some of those cost considerations because they do suggest a slowing trend going forward. I grouped Texas here in with what I usually think of as the SEC states. Texas is still a Big 12 state, but I'm from a Big 10 state, and we now include Maryland and New Jersey, so what do I know? But this is the fastest growing region of the United States, and the states in green are the top tier. So this is over the last decade. Texas, the Carolinas, and Florida are really kind of the outperforming states in terms of underlying population growth. All right, so if you get population growth but you don't have sufficient housing supply, what happens? Well, you get home price gains. And this is Federal Housing Finance Agency data. You can see here, Texas actually fared pretty well during the Great Recession. Only about a 4% aggregate price decline on housing during the Great Recession. And that was during a time when the country as a whole actually experienced about a 19% price decline. So not much of a Great Recession impact, but then you can see the trend line here. Texas home prices growing a lot faster than the country as a whole. And in fact, that 151% measure says that basically prices right now on a nominal basis are 51% higher than they were in the prior peak during the recession itself. So prices are growing, and that's the reason that you see that declining trend in housing affordability. All right, what about the state of the overall economy? Well, 2018 was a pretty good year, supported by tax reform, those business tax cuts, the deregulation agenda that was in place in DC, hurt a little bit by some of the trade conflicts. I'm an economist. I don't like tariffs. I don't like trade wars. But nonetheless, we got to about a 2.9% growth rate, pretty close to the Trump administration's objective of a 3% rate. And by the way, when they were saying they were going to get to 3%, there were a lot of economists who said impossible because they had been looking at prior years like 2017 when growth was only 2.2. Basically saying the economy was stuck at 2.2 and that's kind of where it's going to be. No, tax reform, tax cuts did accelerate the economy. However, what we've got in our forecast is slowing growth going forward. Now we started the year off pretty well, 3.1% growth rate in the first quarter, and slowed down in the second quarter to 2.1%. So for the year, we think we're going to end at about 2.5, a decent growth rate, not as good as 2018, but it's in 2020 and 2021 that I would encourage you to take a look at. I don't have a full-blown recession in our forecast. What we do have is growth below 2%, which indicates that you'll have a couple of slow quarters, maybe something like a growth recession where the unemployment rate's going up because the economy is growing, but it's not growing fast enough to keep the unemployment rate down at the currently really low levels. So we don't have a forecast of a recession. This is currently the longest growth trend in the United States history. So a recession is due sometime in the next medium terms, but we think the probability of a recession over the next 24 months is something like 1 chance out of 3. Now, the Fed is in kind of a tough spot. They probably made a big mistake in 2018 by ratcheting up the Fed funds rate, that's the red line here. They raised interest rates way too fast. And so they're kind of pulling back on that. And in fact, just the last week, we got the first rate cut from the Federal Reserve in a decade. This is a kind of a good measure of the inverted yield curve. Anytime the red line gets above the blue line, which is the 10-year Treasury, you get an inversion of the yield curve. Now, something to note here. That typically predicts a recession, but it's not guaranteed. In fact, there were a couple of times in the 90s when the yield curve either inverted or just slightly inverted, and you didn't get a recession. So when we're thinking about sort of the future of where the macroeconomy is going right now, the question we've been asking ourselves is, are we more likely in a 1998 situation or a 2000 situation? In 98, the Fed was able to cut rates and keep the growth cycle going. It was helped by a tax cut that was put into place in 97. Or are we in a situation like 2000 where the Fed has not moved fast enough in order to reduce rates and we're going to experience a slowdown? In either case, we're not talking about a recession like we saw in 2008. That was a once-in-a-lifetime event like the Great Depression. We don't have anything like that. That was a financial crisis combined with an economic crisis. But what we're trying to examine is whether or not we see a slowdown in the future. We do think, in addition to trade wars and any kind of international conflict, that the biggest macro risk is really the tight labor market. Now, the red line is the unemployment rate. I mean, it's amazing, at 3.7%. If you had asked most economists 5 years ago, could we have a sustained period of time where unemployment was below 4% and you had basically no measurable inflation, most economists would have said no way. So the labor market's actually in really good shape. But of course, economists always like to find bad news, and the bad news here is the job openings rate, which is a measure of sort of the labor shortage for the US economy. You can see that the number of jobs that are basically open and unfilled continues to rise. And you've probably heard the statistic before, but it bears worth repeating. You could take every single individual in the United States who's unemployed, put them in a job, and you would still have open jobs in the US economy. And of course, we know that best of all in the construction industry, because the construction labor shortage has been in place basically for the last 4 or 5 years. We're currently short about 370,000 workers, and that red line is kind of an intensity measure of the labor shortage. And the current rate of open jobs in the construction industry has been greater for the last 2.5 years than it was at the peak rate of job openings during the building boom, despite the fact that we're not building anywhere near as many houses. So that's a real kind of indication of how severe the labor shortage is and the reason for technologies like the 3D printing that Larry walked us through. All right, part of the reason for the labor shortage is demographic. I've been calling this as a Gen Xer, the Gen X gap, and this is kind of a simple way of presenting it. This is the growth in the US labor force that's 55 and older, kind of starting point here. Over the last 2 decades, we've added about 18 million workers on a net basis who are 55 and older. So that's the aging of the baby boomers. If you look at that red line, and this is the reason we've got a labor shortage, that under 55 group has grown by less than 1 million workers over the last 2 decades. And the reason for that is the baby boomers are a big population group, the millennials are. Gen X is a relatively small group, and for that reason, we've got a labor shortage, and it's particularly concentrated in sectors that require physical effort and work, so construction, energy, and transportation. And it's just going to take a while to work our ways out of it. But it's more than just simply adding new workers to the industry. We have to increase labor productivity in the sector. And that red line is construction worker productivity, and it's basically flat over the last 2.5 decades, despite the fact that the US labor productivity for the overall economy is up 34%. Now, this is the reasons that 3D printing, panelized construction, modular construction, other ways of bringing more advanced tools to the work site is going to be a required trend going forward. We've got to raise worker productivity in the sector in order to build more with less. All right, the forecast. This is the national forecast for single-family starts. I've been actually chasing it down a little bit for 2019. We've got it now officially at a negative 1% growth rate for the year. For the first half of 2019, when we compare it against the first half of 2018, single-family construction is down about 5%. So our forecast to get to a kind of a 1% decline, which is pretty close to flat, requires basically a second half acceleration that we do think will be supported by those lower interest rates that we see in the marketplace today. Mortgage interest rates right now right around 3.5%, 3.6%. So that will stoke some additional housing demand. But basically, if you look at the medium-term forecast, we're looking at a nationwide production of about 900,000 units. and that will continue that underbuilding that Larry walked you through, because we think the market requires about 1 million or 1 million single-family homes per year. In terms of the Texas numbers, you see here 126,000 units of single-family construction in 2018. That was a 10% growth rate, an outstanding growth rate for 2018. This year, if you look at the first half data, the state of Texas is just like nationwide, down about 5% thus far, and our forecasting models suggest about flat conditions when the year of 2019 ends for the overall state of Texas. This map is the local growth rates for 2018, so this is not 2019 data, but a lot of green markets. I do this once or twice a week. There are plenty of states that are in red. Red is declines for 2018. Green is growing faster than the country as a whole, and yellow is growing but slower than the country. This is kind of really advantageous position to be in, a lot of growth in local markets in terms of single family in 2018. All right, some future trends that are worth noting, again, kind of as a complement to Larry's presentation. There's a lot of discussion about panelized construction. This is one way of addressing at least the framing carpenter labor shortage. And while I do think there's going to be growth in this marketplace, I think it's kind of important to note that this is kind of highly concentrated in a couple of regions, but the most important number, this is 2017 data, panelized construction, which is basically 2D home construction, is less than 2% of single-family starts. So we are going to get growth in this market, but it remains a relatively small part of the overall single-family market. This is just kind of to emphasize the fact that there are no silver bullets to some of these challenges. Modular construction, building most of the home in a factory, 3D construction of homes. 1.6% of single-family starts is modular, and a lot of it is concentrated in the mid-Atlantic. So we're going to see gains in this type of construction. It's going to be an additional option, but to kind of curb your enthusiasm with some of the hype that you hear, these remain relatively small shares of the overall single-family market. Another market that represents some of the changes and the reflection of the housing affordability crisis is single-family built for rent. CNBC ran a story a few weeks ago where they said this market was exploding. I had talked to the reporter before the story came out. I was on an airplane when it was published. I immediately emailed her and said, that's not really what the data says. There are a lot of people talking about single-family built for rent because the high-production national builders are getting into it. But the market share for this is less than 5% in 2018. Yes, there's a little bit of growth in the count of these types of homes being built. We do think that growth will continue, but we're talking about a 5% single-family market share, and historically it's been about 3%. So we've gone from 3 to 5. If you think from going 3 to 5% is exploding, all right, the headline was justified. She did not respond to my email, so she didn't like that very much. It's part of the job. It's, whatever. Now, a market that is expanding and actually represents a fairly substantial part of single-family construction is townhouse construction, single-family attached. And we do lump these in with single-family like the Census Bureau does. Currently, the market share of these kinds of homes is about 14%. And in 2018, this market was up 15%. So in a market where we've got lot shortages, land shortages, millennials that increasingly want to buy homes but want more walkable environments, we are pretty bullish about growth in the townhouse construction market, and I think this market share is going to continue to trend up over the next 5 years. And I wanted to give you a kind of a sense of where some of the regional conditions are. This is a new index that NAHB is publishing. It's called the Home Building Geography Index, where we lump county-level data into various kinds of economic regions, like rural areas, small towns, big metros. This is large metro outlying counties. And more or less, these are the exurbs of the United States in cities that have about 1 million or more population. In the first quarter of 2019, these exurbs were up 1.6% compared to the first quarter of 2018. And unfortunately, at the start of 2019, this was the only region, according to our kind of our regional buckets, that posted a net gain in single-family construction at the start of 2019. That's how severe the housing affordability crunch was at the end of 2018. So it was ex-urban markets that had access to relatively cheaper land that were able to grow. And then on the other side, the worst performing region were large metro suburban counties, close in, higher priced, lots of high loan-to-value ratio buyers and very sensitive to interest rates. and they were down 10% year over year. So when the brakes got hit, as mortgage interest rates got to 5%, it was a lot of places like Los Angeles where year over year, the LA market's down 20% compared to where it was in 2018. So, you know, it's these kind of close-in, high-value markets, which we think are in demand, where the wind really came out of the sails with the housing affordability crisis. And the last slide, I always kind of include this slide just to remind people of the long-term outlook. This is the population profile of the United States. That blue line is basically where the U.S. population is. The vertical axis is a count of people, and the horizontal axis is ages. So I've divided it into generational groups. Here's the Gen X gap that I talked about before. Here's the baby boomers, and I'm sick of, as a Gen Xer, I'm sick of talking about the millennials, but there they are. You can see why we talk about the millennials so much. It's just a huge generational group that in the middle of their distribution right now is kind of grouped in their late 20s. And we know they're the most educated generation, they're the largest generation, they're doing things later in life, getting married later, having kids later, and they're buying homes later. But the median age of a first-time homebuyer in the US has traditionally been 31, 32 years old. So as this group ages to the right, the demand for single-family homes, and not necessarily apartments and not necessarily ADUs, accessory dwelling units, putting people in someone else's shed, attic, or basement, but single-family home growth demand is really going to grow on a structural basis over the next 5 to 10 years. So we've got challenges. I kind of walked you through some of those on the labor side, the productivity side, some of the macro headwinds, because we know we're going to have to navigate those over the next 2 to 3 years. But the underlying demand for single-family construction is going to grow and grow and grow. So I am not sure where I am on time, but let me give you a quick little ad before we find out if I got any time for questions. My email address is right there in the middle of the screen. Feel free to email me if you want a copy of this presentation, PDF. My Twitter account, if you're a social media person. Thanks, Scott, for the ad at the introduction, but eyeonhousing.org is our economics blog, and I'm happy to talk to anybody. Oh, okay, we do have time for questions. Any questions, anything you want to talk about in a little more detail? Yeah, we'll start in the back there. If we have a socialist in the White House? Is that what you said? If we get a socialist in the White House, well, one, I don't think we're going to get a socialist in the White House. Jim Tobin, our chief lobbyist in NAHB, can maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I'm a supply-side conservative economist. I am worried about some of the trends in D.C. We're in a nice little period here where we're getting the right moves on the deregulation agenda, on tax cuts. Like I said, my own personal preference, I would wrap these trade conflicts up as quickly as possible. The lumber tariffs hurt us in 2018. The Chinese tariffs are hurting our industry on steel and steel and aluminum issues going forward. So we wrap these up. Socialism would not be good. It certainly wouldn't be the reason we would sustain a kind of a low unemployment rate. But you know, if you're looking at DC trends right now, one of the things that's unique that's happening right now, housing's profile is really being raised. And we're working really hard at NHB, for example, to make sure that housing is a 2020 election issue. I know we got Alicia Huey here who's running for the senior officer ladder. You can talk to her about, you know, sort of where we see NHB going over the next couple of years. But the White House issued an executive order on housing affordability. So they recognize that the crisis that I mentioned is in play, and they've directed HUD and Treasury and other executive departments to find ways for the federal government to incentivize state and local governments to reduce those regulatory burdens that have prevented us from bending that cost curve, that have added costs. So if we were to go the other direction, I would definitely say that would be a negative for the overall economy and negative for the housing markets. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, so the labor shortage is kind of interesting. We've actually had some pretty good discussions with Jared Kushner in the White House. He's kind of the go-to point person on workforce development. Obviously, some of the immigration issues have hurt us. So one of the things that NHB has been advocating for is any kind of comprehensive immigration bill, which doesn't look like it's going to happen in the near term. but there needs to be an acceptable quota for construction workers. And I'll give you an example of something that doesn't work. In previous rounds of comprehensive immigration bills, there were things like a 15,000 cap on construction workers that could be brought into the country per year. Now, I gave you the number. We're short 370,000 workers. So 15,000 we calculated was too small. We were advocating for something like 50,000. So we're definitely at the table trying to fight for those kinds of policies. I think that's kind of stalled right now. But the other issue with workforce development is, and I took the slides out, I wish I hadn't, is the student loan crisis. We have a $1.5 trillion of student loans. You say, okay, what's the connection to the labor shortage? What's amazing that 40% of students who go to four-year universities do not graduate with a degree in 5 years. They leave with $20,000 or $30,000 in student loans that they can't pay back. They don't get the lift in lifetime income that you traditionally assume if you majored in the right field with a college degree. And yet we've got a labor shortage of jobs that are in demand, and actually we have a declining share, despite the slowdown in immigration, a declining share of domestic-born workers in the construction industry. It's ticked down just a little bit. It's still 75%, but it actually has gone down. So we've got a real challenge trying to bring people in. So one thing that the Federation can do, state association, local associations, NAHB, is work with trade schools and community colleges to get people the skill training necessary to bring them into jobs that are in demand. And the example I often use, I have a younger brother who's a math professor. I have a younger cousin who's a plumber in Minnesota. And whenever we get together for family gatherings, the plumber likes to tell the math professor, you know, I make 3 times what you do. So who's better at numbers now? To the math professor. So, you know, we've got those challenges, but I think this is an area where working at all the different layers of the Federation and why your membership in those associations is so important, because as Larry mentioned, the labor challenge is the #1 issue, limiting the ability to increase volume and reduce costs going forward. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. That really was. Thank you, Dr. Dietz, for providing us this very useful information. That was a great conversation. Let's give him and Larry Haines one more round of applause.